The bus from Harrisburg let me off at the corner of Route 23 and Mill Creek Road at 4:47 on a Thursday afternoon, the 14th of September, 2023. Nobody was waiting for me. I stood on that empty shoulder for 38 minutes with my grandfather's army duffel at my feet and a long-handled shovel across my shoulder because it had not fit inside the bag. I was 19 years old. I weighed 112 pounds. I had $487 folded into the inside pocket of my grandmother's barn coat, a deed to 152 acres in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and a letter from the bank that used the word foreclosure on line 3. 60 days. That was what they gave me. 60 days to bring a dead man's farm back from the edge of a cliff he had been pushed off of, though I did not know yet that he had been pushed. When the red Ford F-250 finally slowed on the gravel, the man behind the wheel did not introduce himself. He looked at me the way men look at a girl asking the wrong questions in a feed store, and he said, "You the Caldwell girl." His name was Reuben Kruger. Within 40 minutes, he offered me $85,000 cash for everything: the house, the barn, the herd, the silence. He did not know my grandfather had left me a key. He did not know what was behind the door. The bus from Harrisburg let me off at the corner of Route 23 and Mill Creek Road at 4:47 on a Thursday afternoon, the 14th of September, 2023. Nobody was waiting for me. I had written to Mr. Whitlock, the lawyer in Lancaster, 3 times. He had written back twice. The second letter, in his careful blue ink on heavy cream paper, said that someone from the county would meet me at the stop and drive me the 4 miles out to the property. Nobody came. I stood on that empty shoulder for 38 minutes with my grandfather's army duffel at my feet and a long-handled shovel across my shoulder, because it had not fit inside the bag. The wind came off the cornfield in long, slow waves, and it smelled like diesel and cut hay and something sweeter underneath. Something I would later learn was the clover my grandfather Silas had seeded in 1971 and never let anyone plow under. Not in 52 years. Not for any price. I was 19 years old. I weighed 112 pounds. I had $487 folded into the inside pocket of my grandmother's barn coat. I had a name, Adeline Marie Caldwell, and a deed to 152 acres in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, that the First National Bank of Lancaster had already sent me 2 letters about. The second letter used the word foreclosure. The first one used the word concern. 60 days. That was what they gave me. 60 days to bring a dead man's farm back from the edge of a cliff he had been pushed off of, though I did not know yet that he had been pushed. The sky over Lancaster County in mid-September is a color you don't see anywhere else. Not blue, not gray. Something in between, like an old shirt washed too many times. The clouds moved slow and low, and somewhere off to the east, a crow was calling from a fence post, and the asphalt under my boots still held the heat of the afternoon. And I thought, This is the country my grandfather walked away from when he was 18 years old and came home to when he was 26, and never left again until they carried him out feet first on the 11th of June. A red Ford F250 finally slowed on the gravel. A 2009 model with a dented tailgate and a Berks County Volunteer Fire Department sticker on the rear window that had faded to the color of old straw. The man behind the wheel leaned across the passenger seat and looked at me through the open window the way men in feed stores look at a girl asking about the price of barbed wire. He did not introduce himself. He said, "You the Caldwell girl." When I said yes, he made a small sound through his teeth, like he had bet someone $5 on a question and lost. His name was Reuben Kruger. He owned the 240 acres east of ours, and within 40 minutes of driving me up the long gravel lane to the farmhouse, he had used the phrase, "do yourself a favor" 4 times, and the phrase, "fair price" twice, and the phrase, "this place killed your grandfather once," quietly, like he was doing me a kindness by saying it out loud. He offered me $85,000 cash for the whole 152 acres. The house, the barn, the 2 outbuildings, the herd of 19 Holsteins, what was left of them. Even the chickens, he said, with a wave of his hand. Even the chicken's sweetheart. He said he could have the papers ready by Monday. He said a girl my age belonged in a town with sidewalks. I told him I would think on it. He laughed. It was not a mean laugh exactly. It was the laugh men use when they are already certain how a story ends and they are being patient with the chapter you are in. He drove off down the lane and the dust settled, and I stood in front of the farmhouse my great-grandfather had built in 1931, holding a shovel I did not yet know how to use. The house was a 2-story white clapboard with a wraparound porch on the east and south sides, and a tin roof painted dark green that had gone the color of moss along the seams. The 3rd porch board from the front door gave half an inch under my weight. The screen door spring had been replaced at least twice. You could see the 2 older mounting holes above the current one if you knew where to look. Inside the house smelled like cold wood stove and Murphy's oil soap, and something faintly sweet underneath, which I later learned was the smell of a mouse that had died inside the wall above the pantry sometime in February and never been removed because my grandfather had been too sick by then to climb a ladder. The kitchen had a Frigidaire from 1978 that still ran a porcelain sink with 2 old burns in the enamel, and on the wall above the table, a framed photograph of my grandparents on their wedding day, August of 1969. My grandmother Cordelia was 23. My grandfather Silas was 29. He wore his army dress uniform. The Berlin Brigade patch was visible on his left shoulder. His face in that photograph was the face of a man who had seen the world and decided to come home to 152 acres in Pennsylvania. And that was the choice he was going to live with for the rest of his life. I set the duffel by the door. I set the shovel against the wall. I took the envelope out of my coat. The lawyer in Lancaster, a man named Daniel Whitlock of Whitlock and Reese on North Duke Street, had handed me that envelope 11 days earlier. It was marked only with my name in my grandfather's handwriting. Addie. Just that. No surname, no instruction. Inside the envelope were 4 keys on a loop of baling twine, a folded square of paper with a 6-digit combination written in pencil, and a single line also in pencil in handwriting I would have known in the dark. The south door of the milk house first, then everything else in order. I had not yet opened the south door of the milk house. I had not yet been brave enough. I made myself a cup of coffee on the gas stove. The flames still worked. I sat at the kitchen table in my grandmother's chair, the one closest to the window, and I watched the light change over the south pasture, and I thought about what Reuben Kruger had said. This place killed your grandfather. You know that. I knew my grandfather had died of a heart attack on the morning of June 11th, alone in the milking parlor, with the radio still playing the 6 o'clock farm report from WKZF out of Lancaster. I knew that the neighbor lady, Mrs. Sutterfield, had found him a little after 7 when she came over to ask about borrowing a feed scoop. I knew the coroner had written natural causes, age 83 history of cardiovascular disease, and the funeral home in Mannheim had handled everything because my grandfather had paid for his own arrangements in advance back in 2019, the way men of his generation did. But there was a thing about Reuben Kruger's voice when he said it, a thing about the way he said, "You know that," like he was reminding me of something I should have already understood. Like he was telling me a secret without telling me a secret. I did not understand it yet. I would. I drank the coffee. I rinsed the cup. I put on my grandfather's barn coat over my grandmother's barn coat because the temperature was already starting to drop with the sun. And I walked into Mannheim that evening on foot because the old Chevy in the barn would not turn over, and I did not yet know why. The walk was 2.5 miles. I made it in just under an hour. Mannheim, Pennsylvania has a population of 4,812. It has 1 stoplight. It has a feed store, a hardware store, a tractor dealership, a Lutheran church built in 1894, a Methodist church built in 1912 pizza places, and 1 diner that has been on the same corner since the Eisenhower administration. It is called the Plow and Stars. I went there because I did not know where else to go, and because I was 19 years old and alone, and because something inside me, some animal part, knew that I needed to be around people for a little while before I went back to that empty house. I sat at the counter. I ordered coffee. I ordered nothing else because I did not know yet how to stretch $487 across 60 days. The man on the stool 2 seats down from me wore a brown canvas jacket with a patch on the left shoulder I had seen on my grandfather's old coat in the upstairs closet. A black and white patch with a circle and a sword. United States Army Berlin Brigade. He was somewhere past 70. His hair was the color of old steel. He held his coffee cup with both hands the way men of a certain age do when their hands have started to remind them in the morning of every fence they ever pulled tight. He looked at me sideways. He looked at my face. He set his cup down very slowly. He said, "You're Silas Caldwell's granddaughter." It was not a question. I said yes. He said, "Your grandfather pulled me through a chain-link fence at Checkpoint Charlie in October of 1963. The wire took the meat off the back of my left hand all the way to the bone. He carried me almost a quarter mile before the medic jeep reached us. I was 20 years old. I had been in country 11 days. He never told a soul about it for the rest of his life. Not even your grandmother." He held out his left hand. The scar was still there, a pale ridge running from the base of his thumb to his wrist, 60 years old, faded to the color of skim milk under the diner's fluorescent lights. He said, "My name is Earl Pemberton. I live out on Hollow Run Road, 3 miles past your gate. If you need anything at all, you come find me first. You do not call the bank. You do not call the sheriff. You do not call Reuben Kruger. You come find me. Are we clear?" I nodded. I could not speak. He laid $2 bills on the counter for his coffee. He stood up. He set his hat on his head and adjusted it the way old soldiers adjust hats, with the back of his wrist instead of his fingers. He said one more thing before he left. He said, "Your grandfather was the finest man I ever served with, and I have been waiting 48 years to pay him back. You let me, Adeline. You let me." Then he walked out into the parking lot, and the bell above the door rang once, and he was gone. I walked back to the farmhouse in the dark. The temperature had dropped into the upper 40s. There was no moon. The gravel of Mill Creek Road crunched under my boots in a steady rhythm, and I counted the steps the way my grandfather had taught me to count steps when I was 7 years old, and we walked the back fence together, looking for breaks. 1,420 steps from the diner to the corner of Route 23. Another 3,300 to the gate. I unlatched the gate. I latched it behind me. I stood in the lane and looked at the dark shape of the milk house 40 feet off the east side of the barn, low and square against the night sky. 2 doors. A wide north door for the cans. A narrow south door that my grandmother had told me when I was 6 years old never to go through. "Not that one, Addie. That one is your grandfather's." I had not been brave enough that afternoon. I was not brave enough that night either. I went to bed in my grandmother's bed, in the room that smelled like lavender soap and old quilts, and I lay there for a long time, listening to the house settle around me. The boards in the front hallway making small popping sounds as the temperature dropped, the wind moving in the eaves. Somewhere far off, a barn owl calling, and another one answering. I slept 3 hours. I was awake again at 5:30. I made the coffee. I drank it standing at the kitchen window, watching the eastern sky go from black to gray to the color of weak tea. The fields beyond the south pasture were silver with frost. The cottonwoods along the creek were black against the sky. I put on the coat. I took the loop of twine out of my pocket. The 4 keys clicked against each other in the cold. The smallest one, brass, no bigger than my thumb, caught the kitchen light from the window above the sink. The brass key looked too small to matter. That was the trick of it. The big iron ones, the ones for the barn and the corn crib and the smokehouse, those announced themselves. This one was the kind of key a person puts on a chain and forgets about. Except my grandmother had kept it on the same loop for what Earl Pemberton would later tell me was at least 36 years. Maybe more. Maybe since the year my grandfather came home from Berlin. I walked out across the dead grass to the milk house. I kept my hands in my pockets so the keys would not clatter. The wind had picked up out of the northwest, and the air smelled like wet leaves and the cold mineral smell of the creek a half-mile to the west. The north door was unlocked. It had always been unlocked when I was small. My grandmother used to send me in there for the steel pail that hung on a nail by the wash sink, and I would stand on my toes to reach it and watch the way the light came through the one high window and fell on the concrete floor in a perfect square. The square was still there when I pushed the north door open and stepped inside that morning. September 15th, 2023, Friday, 6:14 a.m. The pail was gone. The nail was still in the wall. Somebody my grandmother probably had taken the pail down at some point and not put it back. And that small absence felt like the whole house in miniature. A small thing missing in a place where small things should not go missing, in a family that had been quietly losing pieces of itself for a very long time without anyone in the next county noticing. The south door was inside the milk house. That is the part I had forgotten, or maybe never known. From the road, you would think it opened to the outside, but it did not. It opened from the back wall of the washroom into whatever was behind it, and there was no window on that side of the building at all. I had walked around the milk house 100 times as a child, and never thought about the fact that the south wall from outside was about 6 feet longer than the washroom was from inside, a grown man's stride and a half. The kind of thing a child does not measure and an adult does not question because the building has always been there and the wall has always been that length. I stood in the square of weak morning light with the brass key in my fingers. The door was painted the same cream color as the washroom walls, so that unless you were looking for it, your eye slid right past. There was no handle, just a keyhole low about waist height on me with a small iron plate around it. The iron gone dark with age, and one tiny scratch on the plate where a key had missed the slot more than once a long time ago. I slid the brass key into the keyhole. It caught on something inside, then turned slow with that small, dry click that old locks make when the bolt is older than the hand turning it. The door did not swing open. I had to set my fingertips against the cream paint and push. And even then, it gave only an inch the way a door does when the frame has settled around it over 40 years and forgotten that it was ever meant to move. I put my shoulder to it. The hinges made a sound like a cat clearing its throat. Then the door eased back and the smell came out. Dry, mineral, faintly sweet. The way a closed pantry smells when nothing has spoiled, but everything has aged. It was not a closet. It was a room about 6 feet deep, 8 feet across, the same width as the washroom itself. The walls were narrow pine boards, vertical, painted the same cream color once, and now the color of weak tea. A bare bulb hung from a porcelain socket on a black cloth-wrapped cord that ran up into the rafters. I did not try the switch. I doubted there was current in that line anymore. And if there was, I did not trust 40-year-old wiring to be polite about it. The light from the washroom reached about 3 feet in and gave up. I went back to the kitchen. I took the flashlight from the drawer next to the stove. A yellow Eveready my grandfather had owned since at least the Reagan administration, judging by the price sticker still half stuck to the side. I came back. I clicked it on. The beam was weak and yellow warm the way old flashlights are. But it was enough. There were shelves, 3 rows of them floor to ceiling on the left-hand wall. Built of the same pine as the walls, the lumber rough on the edges where someone had cut it by hand with a saw and not bothered to sand it because nobody was meant to see this room. On the shelves stood mason jars, dozens of them, but they were not preserves. They were too dry inside. No water-clear shine, no color of fruit. I lifted one down. It was light. Inside was a folded piece of paper rolled into a tube, tied with a piece of brown garden twine. I sat down on the concrete floor with the jar between my knees and unscrewed the lid. The lid was Ball brand, the old kind with the glass insert and the zinc ring. The kind they stopped making in 1962. My grandmother had told me that once sitting at the kitchen table holding one up like a piece of evidence. I had been maybe 7 years old. I remembered her voice now. Anything older than this one, Addie, you don't throw away. You ask me first. I had not understood why she was telling me. I had forgotten until that moment that she had told me at all. The paper inside the jar was the color of weak tea, folded into thirds, then folded again so it would fit through the mouth. I worked it out slowly. My hands were shaking, not from cold. The washroom was warmer than the kitchen because the sun had been on the south wall for about an hour by then. The shaking came from something else. From the feeling I'd had the morning the loan officer at First National Bank of Lancaster, a man named Lon Schlagel, had slid the loan documents back across his desk and said, "Miss Caldwell, I think you should give this one more season before you take on any debt at all." That same shaky feeling, like being handed a thing you weren't sure you were allowed to hold. I unfolded the paper on my knee. It was lined notebook paper. the kind with the red margin down the left side, torn out of a spiral binding so the edge was ragged. The handwriting was my grandfather's. I knew it the way you know the shape of your own name. He had written my grandmother letters every week the year he was in Berlin, and she had kept them in a hat box in the closet of the upstairs bedroom, and I had read them when I was 12, sitting cross-legged on the floor while a thunderstorm worked itself out over the ridge. His letters slanted forward the way the words were leaning into a headwind. The note in the jar said this: "Addie, if you find this, I am not here. The south pasture fence line has been moved 8 feet north of where my grandfather Elias put it in 1937. Kruger knows what he took. The original survey is in the green ledger third shelf, the one with the leather corner. Do not let Reuben tell you otherwise. He knows. Open the smokehouse before the snow comes. Open the milk house first. There is more here than I could say while I was alive. I am sorry it has to come to you this way. You are not as alone as you think. Silas." April 25th, 2023. I read it 3 times, then I read it a 4th time. Slower. With my finger under the words. Like I was 8 years old again, at the kitchen table working through a chapter book. April 25th, 2023. My grandfather had died on the 11th of June, 2023. 47 days later. He had written this letter 47 days before his heart stopped. He had put it in a mason jar and sealed the lid and walked it out to the milk house and set it on a shelf where a woman might look someday and not a man clearing out tools. He had known something. He had known something he could not say out loud to anyone living. I folded the paper back along its creases. I sat on the cold concrete floor of that hidden room with the jar in my lap and the flashlight in my hand, and the wind was moving across the tin roof of the milk house with a sound like distant traffic. And I sat there for a long time without moving. The light from the high window shifted from gray to silver to pale gold as the sun came up over the eastern ridge. I could hear the rooster down at the Sutterfield place, a 1/4 mile away, and a single car going by on Route 23, and the slow tick of the tin roof expanding as the morning warmed. I put the letter back inside the jar. I put the jar back on the shelf. I made myself promise that I would not run, not yet. Even though every part of me wanted to walk back to the farmhouse and pack the duffel and walk to the corner of Route 23 and Mill Creek Road and get on the first bus that came. I made myself stand up. I made myself walk out of the hidden room. I made myself lock the south door behind me and put the brass key back on the loop and put the loop back in my coat. I walked across the yard to the house. The sky was full daylight by then, a pale, clear blue, the kind of sky you get in Pennsylvania in late September, when the air has been scrubbed by the first cold front of the autumn. I went inside. I sat at the kitchen table. I tried to drink another cup of coffee, My hands were still shaking. I did not hear the truck pull up the lane. I heard the boots on the porch first. Heavy boots. A man's stride. Then a knock on the doorframe. 3 slow knocks, the way men of my grandfather's generation knock. Not the rapid hammering of a younger man. Just 3 deliberate strikes against old wood. I opened the door. It was Reuben Kruger. He was wearing a cleaner shirt than the day before, a green check flannel under a brown Carhartt vest. He held his cap in his hands the way a man holds a cap when he wants you to think he is being respectful. He said, "Morning, Adeline. Thought I'd come by and see how you slept." I said I slept fine. He stood on the porch for a moment, looking past me into the kitchen. His eyes moved slow. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the room behind me, at the table, at the photograph on the wall above it, at the open doorway to the front hall, where my grandmother's quilts were folded over the back of the rocking chair. He said, "Mind if I come in?" I said yes. I said it before I had time to think about it. I said, "Yes, I do mind, and I am not selling, and I would appreciate it if you would not come back up the lane without calling first." His face did not change. He smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. He said, "Sweetheart, I'm just trying to help. You're a young girl out here all alone. Your grandfather was a stubborn man. It is what killed him in the end. I would hate to see that happen to you too." He set his cap back on his head. He stepped down off the porch. He looked at the milk house on his way to the truck. He looked at it for a long second. Longer than a man would normally look at an outbuilding he had seen 1,000 times. Then he got in the F250 and drove off down the lane, and the gravel crunched under the tires, and the dust hung in the air behind him for a long minute after he was gone. I closed the door. I locked it. I had never in my life locked a door in the daytime. I walked through the house. I checked every window. I checked the back door off the mudroom. I checked the cellar door. I checked the upstairs windows in both bedrooms. The house was solid. The locks were old, but they held. When I came back downstairs, I saw it. A small white rectangle on the kitchen floor, just inside the front door, near the rag rug, where I always set my boots. He must have dropped it on the porch, and the wind had carried it under the door. Or he had slid it under on purpose. I would never know which. It was a business card, cream-colored, embossed, the kind of card a man does not get printed for under $3 a piece. The lettering was dark blue. Enercore Energy Solutions, Mid-Atlantic Fracking Division, Vincent Marsh Acquisitions Manager. A phone number, an email address, an office in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. I sat down on the kitchen floor next to the rag rug with the business card in my hand, and I looked at it for a long time, and I thought about what my grandfather had written in the letter in the jar. "There is more here than I could say while I was alive. A fracking company." Reuben Kruger was not just trying to buy a farm. Reuben Kruger was the middleman for somebody much larger. And somebody much larger had already decided what they wanted out of these 152 acres, and they were willing to use a man like Reuben to get it. I put the business card in my coat pocket next to the loop of keys. I walked out the back door. I walked across the side yard past the chicken house, past the propane tank, past the row of black walnut trees my great-grandfather had planted in 1939, and I walked down toward the back pasture where the old hand-dug well still sat in its ring of stones. The well had not been used in 40 years. There was a galvanized cap on it, weighted with a stone and a cast-iron pump handle that had rusted into one position. The ground around the well should have been undisturbed. It was not. There were boot prints in the soft earth. 2 sets. Not mine, not my grandfather's, because the prints were fresh, no more than 2 weeks old, the edges still sharp, where the soil had not yet crumbled away. A larger boot size 12 or 13, with a deep lug sole. A smaller boot beside it, maybe size 10, with a smooth sole that left less of a print. 2 men. They had stood at the well together. They had crouched down, both of them, because there were knee impressions in the dirt. They had been there long enough to dig. 6 inches from the wellhead in the soft earth on the south side, there was a small round hole, about 2 inches across, 3 inches deep. Recently filled in and patted smooth, but I could see the outline of the disturbance, because the topsoil they had used to cover it was a slightly different color than the surrounding ground. A soil sample. Somebody had taken a soil sample from inside my fence line, without permission, without telling me, without telling my grandfather, because my grandfather had been dead for 3 months by then, and the prints were not 3 months old. They were 2 weeks old, maybe 3. I stood up. My knees were shaking now, along with my hands. I looked east across the pasture, toward the line of cedars that marked the boundary of Reuben Kruger's land. There was a slight rise there. From the top of that rise, a man with a pair of binoculars could see the entire back half of my property without ever crossing the fence. I walked back to the house slowly. I did not run. I did not look over my shoulder. I made myself walk at a normal pace because I had been raised by people who believed that you do not show a wolf that you have seen him until you have your hand on the gate. I went inside. I locked the door again. I called Earl Pemberton from the kitchen phone. He picked up on the second ring. I told him about the business card. I told him about the boot prints. I told him about the soil sample hole near the old well. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Stay where you are. Lock the doors. I will be there in 15 minutes. He hung up. I sat at the kitchen table with my back to the wall so I could see both the front door and the back door at the same time, and I waited. Earl arrived in 13 minutes. He drove a 1994 Chevy K1500 dark green with a toolbox in the bed and a rifle rack across the back window of the cab. He did not knock when he got to the porch. He called out my name first so I would know it was him, and then he opened the screen door, and he came into the kitchen, and he set a long canvas case on the table. He said, "Show me where the prints are." I took him out to the well. He crouched down beside the disturbed soil. He looked at the boot prints for a long time. He did not touch them. He took out a small notebook from his shirt pocket and a stub of pencil and he sketched the tread pattern. He measured the length of the prints with the span of his hand knuckle to knuckle. He said, "The big one is a red wing, steel-toed, 12.5. That's Reuben. He's been wearing the same boots for 9 years. I'd know that tread anywhere." He looked at the smaller print. He said, "I don't know this one, but he is younger. Heel strike is heavier. Younger men come down harder on the heel." He stood up. He looked at the rise to the east. He looked at the line of cedars. He looked at me. He said, "Adeline, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Reuben Kruger has been buying up land in this section since 1991. 3 farms east of you, 2 south. He waits. He waits for a death or a divorce or a bank letter. Then he comes in with cash. He has done this 11 times that I know of. 11 families gone from this valley in 32 years. He pays maybe 40 cents on the dollar." He paused. He said, "But this is the first time I have ever seen him bring anybody else in. The first time I have ever seen a soil sample hole on Caldwell land. Something has changed. Somebody bigger is paying him this time. Somebody who wants this ground for a reason that has nothing to do with farming it." We walked back to the house. He set the long canvas case on the kitchen table and he unzipped it. Inside was a shotgun, a Remington 8.7, O-Pump 12-gauge walnut stock, worn smooth where a hand had held it for 40 years. The bluing on the barrel was even and dark. The shells in the side saddle were green-cased Federal No. 4 buckshot. He said, "This was your grandfather's. He gave it to me to hold for him in March when he started feeling poorly. He said he wanted you to have it when you came of age. I am giving it to you a little early." He laid it across the table between us. He said, "You are the granddaughter of a Berlin Brigade military policeman. You are the granddaughter of a woman who ran a quilting cooperative that fed 3 farms through the drought of 1988 and did it without ever once asking for credit. You come from people who do not back down, Adeline. So you are not going to back down. You are going to stand on this porch and you are going to make it very clear to Reuben Kruger and to whoever he is working for that this farm is not for sale. And that you are not a 19-year-old girl they can frighten off a property line. Do you understand me?" I nodded. I could not speak. He said, "Good. Now we are going to do something." He went out to his truck. He came back with a piece of plywood about 2 feet square, a can of black exterior paint, and a 4-inch paintbrush. He set them on the porch. He handed me the brush. He said, "You are going to write 3 words on this board. You are going to take your time. You are going to make them clean, and you are going to make them readable from the road. And then we are going to nail it to the south door of the milk house, the door your grandfather wanted you to open first. And every time Reuben Kruger drives up this lane, that sign is going to be the first thing he sees." I opened the can of paint. I dipped the brush. I wrote 3 words across that plywood square in capital letters 6 inches high in black exterior paint that bled a little into the grain of the wood, because plywood always drinks the first coat. I am not selling. Earl handed me 3 roofing nails and a framing hammer. I walked across the yard to the milk house. I climbed up onto an overturned milk crate. I held the plywood against the south wall of the milk house beside the door I had opened that morning, and I drove the first nail through the upper left corner, and the sound of the hammer striking the nail echoed off the side of the barn, and I thought of my great-grandfather, Elias Caldwell, who had built this milk house with his own hands in the summer of 1937, and who had been dead since 1942, and who had not been buried with the rest of the family in Hopewell Cemetery, and who I would learn within the next 2 weeks had been put in the ground by a man named Wilhelm Kruger for the price of 60 acres of unmarked east pasture. I drove the second nail. I drove the third. The wind came up out of the northwest and lifted my hair off the back of my neck, and I climbed down off the milk crate, and I stepped back, and I looked at that sign on the milk house, and I thought, this is the first thing I have done on this farm by myself. This is the first decision I have made that nobody can talk me out of. This is the line. Earl was standing in the lane behind me with his arms folded across his chest. He said one thing. He said, "Good." Then he walked back to his truck, and he reached into the cab, and he came out with a small brass key on a separate piece of leather cord. He held it out to me. He said, "Your grandfather gave me this in April. He told me to give it to you on the morning you decided to fight. I think that morning was about 10 minutes ago." I took the key. It was not like the others. The teeth were cut shallower. The bow had a small horseshoe stamped into it. I said, "What does it open?" Earl looked at the smokehouse, which stood about 90 feet behind the main barn, set into the low rise where the back pasture began to drop down toward the creek. He looked at it for a long second. Then he looked back at me. He said, "Adeline, there is a building on this farm that has been padlocked for 46 years. There is a building on this farm that your grandfather went into exactly once a year on the morning of his birthday. Every year I knew him. I never asked him what was inside. He never told me. But he made me promise that when the time came, I would put that key in your hand and tell you to open it." He pointed at the smokehouse. He said, "That building, that door, that key." He looked up at the sky, where a single thin line of cloud was moving in from the northwest low and slate gray, the way the first weather of October moves in over the Susquehanna Valley. He said, "And I would do it before the snow comes, Addie. The almanac says October 15th this year. That gives us 30 days. He got back in his truck. He drove off down the lane. The dust settled. I stood in the yard with the brass horseshoe key in one hand and Earl's shotgun across my shoulder, and I looked at the smokehouse, and I looked at the milk house with the sign on its south wall, and I looked at the back of the property where two men I did not know had stood beside my well in boots that did not belong to anyone in my family. And I thought about my grandfather, Silas Caldwell, who had walked these 152 acres for 52 years,
who had pulled a stranger through a chain-link fence in Berlin in 1963, and never told a soul, who had written a letter to me in April and sealed it in a mason jar and put it on a shelf where a woman might find it. I thought about what he had written.
"You are not as alone as you think." I thought he was telling me about Earl. I did not yet know that he was telling me about much, much more. The wind shifted out of the north. I could smell the river. My grandfather used to say that smell meant rain inside of 2 days. I went back into the house. I locked the door behind me. I sat at the kitchen table with the shotgun across my knees and the brass horseshoe key in front of me on the wood, and I watched the light fall across the south pasture, and I waited for the morning. The smokehouse stood 90 feet behind the main barn. It was set into the low rise where the back pasture began to drop down toward Mill Creek, and its rear wall pressed into the slope of the hill, so that from the backside you could put your hand flat against the chestnut planks and feel the cold of the earth coming through them. I had not been inside it since I was 9 years old. My grandfather had kept it padlocked then, and when I had asked him once in the summer of 2013 what was in there, he had told me only that it was where the old work lived, and that old work was not a thing for a child to be poking at. I had taken him at his word. After the funeral in June, when the county assessor, a man named Delbert Hine from Caldwell Township, had walked the property with me to update the tax rolls, he had glanced at the smokehouse and written out building fair condition, no value on his clipboard, and moved on. I had let him. The padlock had still been there. It was Saturday, the 16th of September, 2023, just past 7 in the morning, when Earl Pemberton pulled his green Chevy up the lane for the second time in 2 days. He brought coffee in a thermos. He brought 2 ham sandwiches in waxed paper. He brought a kerosene lantern with a fresh wick and a small jar of lamp oil. He brought a crowbar, a roll of mason's twine, a tape measure, and a brown notebook with a soft cover that had the words, "Keep a work log," stamped in faded gold across the front. He set all of it on the kitchen table. He said, "Eat first, then we go in." I ate the sandwich. I drank the coffee. I did not taste either of them. He watched me from across the table without speaking. He held his cup with both hands the way he had held it the night before in the diner, and after a long minute he said, "You did not sleep." I said, "No, sir." He nodded once. He did not press. He understood the kind of not sleeping that comes the night after you have nailed a sign to your own milk house. When we walked out across the side yard, my grandfather's blue heeler, the dog I had been told was named Pete, came out from under the porch and followed at my heel without being asked. Pete was 8 years old. He had not eaten well since June. He had lost weight along the ribs and his coat had gone dull. But that morning,
He walked behind me with his ears forward and his eyes on the smokehouse, the way a working dog walks behind a person he has decided he is going to start trusting again. The smokehouse door was made of 2-inch oak banded with hand-forged iron straps. The padlock was a master number 3, brass-bodied. The kind they had sold at every Tractor Supply between Lancaster and Reading for 60 years. The brass horseshoe key Earl had given me fit on the first try. The shackle came open with a small dry click that sounded loud in the cold morning air. I lifted the lock off and set it on the stone step. I stood there for a long second with my hand on the door and did not open it. Pete sat down behind me and watched. Earl said, "Take your time." I took it. I was not afraid of anything inside that building. I was afraid of what it would mean if my grandfather had been right. If there was something in there that he had felt he could not say out loud to anyone living. I was 19 years old. The bank in Lancaster had given me until November 14th to bring the operating account back to a positive balance, or they would begin formal foreclosure proceedings on the South 40. I had $86 in checking, $312 in a coffee can above the stove. I pulled the door open. The hinges did not scream the way I had expected. They sighed. Whoever had hung that door, and I would learn within the hour that it had been my great-grandfather Elias in the spring of 1939, had set the pins in tallow, and the tallow had outlived him by 81 years and still held. The smell that came out was dry. That was the first thing that surprised me. A building shut up since before I was born should have smelled like rot. This one smelled like old paper and cold iron and the faint sweetness of linseed oil. I lifted the kerosene lantern. The wick took the match on the second try. The light pushed out about 8 feet in front of me and then gave up. I stepped inside. Pete stayed on the stone step. He would not cross the threshold, and I did not make him. Earl came in behind me with the second lantern. The floor was poured concrete. That was wrong for a building of that age. Someone had gone to the trouble and the expense of pouring a slab where a dirt floor would have been cheaper and easier and far more common in the 1930s. The walls were the original chestnut planks, dark with age. There were pegs driven into them at regular intervals, and from the pegs hung tools I did not recognize. Long-handled things, shorter things with crooks at the end. A set of leather straps with brass buckles hung in a careful row, oiled recently enough that the leather still moved when I touched it. Recently, meaning I would guess within the last 15 years, which meant my grandfather had been in here. He had kept this building. Earl held his lantern high and walked slowly along the north wall. He stopped at a workbench. He looked down at it. He did not speak. I came up behind him. On the workbench, set against the wall, was a small wooden box about the length of my forearm. It was made of quarter-sawn oak. The initials E.M. had been burned into the lid with a hot iron. Elias Marcus Caldwell. There was a layer of dust on the lid. The dust was even and undisturbed. Earl said, "He never opened this one. He kept the building, but he never opened this box." I picked it up. It was lighter than it looked. There was a small brass hasp on the front no lock. I set the box back on the bench. I would come back to it. I walked deeper into the room. Against the far wall, under a heavy canvas tarp, was a shape about the size of a chest freezer. I made myself walk the perimeter first the way my grandfather had taught me to walk a pasture before turning animals into it. Slow, eyes moving, looking for what does not belong. The third board from the east wall had a burn mark on it shaped like a thumb. I noticed it. I filed it away. I would come back to it. I went to the tarp. The canvas was heavier than I expected. Oiled cotton duck. When I drew it back, the dust rose in a single sheet and hung in the lantern light like flour in a kitchen at supper time. Underneath was a low cabinet of quarter-sawn oak, 4 drawers, a brass plate on the top. I had to lean close to read the engraving. The letters were sharp where they had been cut, but the brass had gone the color of Willie Caldwell and Son, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, 1923. I stood there for a long time without touching it. My grandfather had been an only child. His father, Elias Caldwell, had been an only child. My great-great-grandfather, a man named Obadiah Caldwell, had also been an only child. I knew this the way you know the layout of a house you grew up in. There were no sons. There had never been sons. The Caldwell line had run thin, just one boy per generation, going back to 1849, when the first Hayes family settled the original parcel, and a Caldwell man married into it. And yet here was a cabinet built in 1923 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, with our last name and a plural attached to it in brass. I knelt down on the concrete floor. The top drawer had a small turned wooden knob walnut by the look of it. When I pulled it, the drawer slid out on dovetailed runners so smooth I could feel the breath of air it pushed ahead of itself. Inside were ledgers, 6 of them, bound in black cloth, stacked flat, the spines facing up. The dates were written in white ink on the cloth in a careful hand. 1923 to 1928. 1928 to 1933, 1933 to 1937. The last one read 1937 to 1942. And below that date, in a different hand, smaller in pencil instead of ink, was the single word closed. I lifted the top ledger out. The cloth was cold against my palms. I opened it on the workbench beside the lantern. The pages were heavy rag paper, the kind that does not yellow so much as deepen like good cream left in a window. The first page was a list of names. Customers, I realized after a moment, because beside each name was a date, a dollar amount, and a description. Mr. Harlan Pickett, June 14th, 1923, 1 Walnut Secretary, $42, half down, half on delivery. Mrs. Eulalia Brand, June 19th,
1923. 2 oak side chairs, $11.50 each, paid in full.
The handwriting was small and patient and slanted slightly to the right, and I had seen it before on the back of a photograph in the kitchen drawer upstairs. A photograph of a man in a wool vest standing beside a porch railing he had built himself. My great-grandfather, Elias. I turned the page. More furniture, some coffins, a few barn doors, a church pew. First Methodist of Mannheim, delivered August of 1924, paid in installments over 11 months. The shop had been a real shop, not a hobby, and it had been busy. I had been told my whole life that my great-grandfather had been a corn farmer who did some carpentry on the side. That was the phrase. On the side. I had heard it from my grandfather, from my grandmother, from the cousin in Reading who came to the funerals. The lantern hissed once and steadied. I turned another page. The 1925 ledger was thicker. I had to set the lantern closer to read the columns. The handwriting had changed halfway through that year. Still careful, still slanted right, but tighter, as if the writer had grown impatient with himself. By March of 1925, the orders had doubled. A roll-top desk for a Dr. Henshaw in Littitz, 12 matching chairs for the Odd Fellows Lodge in Mountjoy, a cradle, no name beside it, only the word gift in parentheses and a price of 0. I ran my thumb along that line longer than I meant to. I opened the third ledger, 1926. And found the first entry that was not furniture at all. Repaired the Hollis barn door west side. 2 days. Materials from the scrap pile. No charge. 3 lines down. Built a coffin for the Hollis boy. No charge. He was 7. I read it twice. The Hollis place was still there. 2 miles east on the county road. Owned now by a man named Roy Hollis, who drove a green Silverado and waved at me sometimes when I was checking the mailbox at the corner. I did not know if the boy in that coffin had been his uncle or his great-uncle or someone further back than that. I made a note on the inside of my left wrist with the pencil stub from my coat pocket. Ask Roy. I turned the page. There were more like it. A rocking chair for the widow Benson. No charge. Her husband helped me cut the ash for it in 1919. A set of shelves for the schoolhouse. No charge. A repair to the church organ bench. No charge. And beside it, in smaller letters, they let my daughter sit in the front pew for free for 2 years after the fire. So this is owed. I did not know about a fire. My grandfather had never mentioned a fire. Earl came up beside me and looked down at the ledger. He said quietly, "The Caldwell house burned in 1919. Lightning strike. Your great-great-grandmother lost everything she had brought from Pottsville. Half the dishes, the family Bible, the wedding quilt her mother had made. They lived in the smokehouse in this building for 14 months, while Elias rebuilt the main house with his own hands." He paused. He said, Your grandfather told me that story exactly once. We were sitting in a guardhouse at Checkpoint Charlie in 1964. It was 3 in the morning. We were drinking bad coffee out of tin cups. He told me his father had taught him that a man's worth was not what he could buy back from the world. It was what he could give to it without asking to be paid. And that whatever the Caldwells had, they had because somebody in this valley had stood up for them once when they had nothing left. He looked at me. He said, "Read the rest, Addie. There is more." I read the rest. The shop kept going through the bad years. 1930, 1931, 1932, when the corn went for nothing and half the county lost the deeds to land their fathers had cleared by hand. Elias took payment in eggs that year, in smoked hams, in a milk cow named Clover that showed up later in the margin of a notebook I would find weeks afterward in the kitchen, listed as the foundation of the small dairy herd my grandfather had inherited. The shop was not on the side. The shop was what kept the farm. The corn was on the side. I had been told it the wrong way around for 19 years, and nobody had bothered to correct it, because by the time I was born, the shop had been closed for 43 years, and the door had been chained, and the story had hardened around the easier version. I closed the ledger. I sat back on my heels. The lantern made a small circle of yellow light around me. Outside, the wind had picked up, and I could hear it pulling at the loose tin on the south side of the smokehouse roof. I opened the second drawer of the cabinet. It was empty except for a single envelope. The envelope was new. The paper was bright white, the kind you buy in a box at the drugstore. It had been placed in the drawer no more than a year ago. On the front, in my grandfather's handwriting, was a single word. Hayes. I picked it up. I opened it. Inside were 3 pages. The first page was a hand-drawn family tree on lined notebook paper. Margaret Eleanor Hayes, born 1813. Married Josiah Hayes, 1832. Settled Maple Hollow Farm, 1849. The line ran down through 6 generations to my grandmother, Cordelia Hayes Caldwell, who had married Silas in 1969. Beside my grandmother's name in different ink, my grandfather had written a single sentence. She was the deed. I was the name. I read it 3 times. The second page was a photocopy of an original deed. The deed was dated November of 1849. The grantor was the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The grantee was Margaret Eleanor Hayes, widow of Berks County. The parcel was 112 acres, the original homestead situated in Lancaster County, on the east bank of Mill Creek. The deed had never been retitled. My grandmother had inherited it in 1962 from her mother. She had brought it into her marriage with my grandfather in 1969. He had farmed it for 54 years, but the underlying title had never been moved out of her name, and after she died in 2021, it had passed to me directly. Not to my grandfather, to me. Through my grandmother, through the Hayes line, the Caldwell name on the mailbox, the Hayes name on the deed, for 174 years. The third page was a list of names, 23 of them, all women, all from this section of Lancaster County. The list was titled in my grandfather's hand, The Cooperative. Beside each name was a date and a number. The earliest date was March of 1968. The latest was September of 1995. At the bottom of the page in pencil, my grandfather had written one more sentence. Cordelia ran it for 27 years. Nobody outside that list ever knew. The books are in the attic in the cedar chest under the south window third shelf behind the Christmas linens. I put the 3 pages back in the envelope. I put the envelope in the inside pocket of my coat next to the brass horseshoe key. I stood up. I said to Earl, "I need to go in the house." He nodded. He stayed in the smokehouse with the lantern to keep going through the cabinet. I walked back across the yard alone. I climbed the stairs to the second floor. I went into the spare bedroom on the south side, the one that had been my grandmother's sewing room before she got sick. The cedar chest was under the window. I had not opened it since I was 12. The brass hinges were stiff, but they moved. The Christmas linens were on the second shelf, folded the way my grandmother folded things, with hospital corners and sprigs of dried lavender between the layers. I lifted them out. The third shelf was a false bottom. I would not have known it if my grandfather had not written it down. The cedar planks looked continuous, but there was a small finger hole drilled into the back left corner, no bigger than a dime. I worked my finger into it. The bottom lifted out as a single panel. Underneath were 14 ledgers, bound in green cloth, stacked flat, the spines facing up. The dates ran from 1968 to 1995. I lifted the top one out. I sat on the floor of that sewing room with the morning light coming through the south window in long, pale stripes across the rag rug, and I opened the first ledger to the first page. The handwriting was my grandmother's. The first entry was dated March 11th, 1968. Eulalia Stanton brought 3 baby quilts, sold them at the Hollidaysburg Craft Fair on March 9th. Net proceeds after thread and batting $22.40. Eulalia keeps $11.20. Cooperative keeps the rest. Use the cooperative share to buy 2 bushels of seed corn for the Pickett family. Joel Pickett's tractor went through the ice on the pond, and they lost most of their stored grain. He does not know where the seed came from. He should not know. Pride is a hard thing to take away from a man. I turned the page. April 3rd, 1968. A delivery of canned tomatoes to the Whitaker farm. No charge after Margaret Whitaker's hip surgery. Seed money came from the cooperative share of 2-pieced quilts sold in Lebanon. Margaret was told they were a gift from the Lutheran women. They were not. The Lutheran women did not know either. I turned the page. I kept turning. For 2 hours, I sat on the floor of that sewing room, and I read what my grandmother and 22 other women had done quietly between March of 1968 and September of 1995 in this corner of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. They had stitched quilts, and they had sold them at craft fairs in 7 counties. They had built up a fund. They had used the fund to buy seed corn for families who had lost crops, to pay vet bills for families who had lost livestock, to cover funeral expenses for children whose parents could not bear to ask. They had done it without ever once telling the people they were helping where the money came from. Some of them did not even know the full list of names. They knew their own piece. My grandmother had kept the whole picture in her head and in these ledgers, and she had kept it secret for 27 years. And then she had locked the cedar chest and put the key on her ring and never spoken of it again. And my grandfather had known, and he had let her have it. And he had been so proud of her that when she died in 2021, the last words he said to me at her funeral were, "She was a better person than anyone in this county will ever understand." I put the ledger down. I sat there for a long time without moving. The light shifted. I closed the cedar chest. I went back down to the smokehouse. Earl was sitting on an overturned milk crate with the lantern at his feet. He had the third drawer of the cabinet open. He looked up when I came in. He said, "There is somebody you need to meet, Addie. He is 75 years old. He lives in a small house on the Lenape farm out past Bowmansville. His name is Nathaniel Whitehorse. Your grandfather knew him for 52 years. He paused. He said, "And he is the only person alive who can tell you what happened to your great-grandfather, Elias, in 1942. We drove out to Nathaniel Whitehorse's place that afternoon. The road bent east out of Mannheim and then north past 3 dairy farms and a Mennonite cabinet shop, and then it climbed a long, low ridge of oaks, and the trees thinned, and we came out onto a small parcel of land, maybe 40 acres, fenced clean with a square white house and a single chimney and a vegetable garden that was still putting up late tomatoes in cages along the south wall. Nathaniel met us on the porch. He was tall, thin. His hair was a long white braid down the middle of his back. He wore a flannel shirt the color of an autumn riverbed, and jeans that had been washed so many times they had gone the color of old denim, which is to say, the color of the sky in November. He shook my hand. His hand was very dry. The skin on the back of it was the color of polished walnut. He said, "Your grandfather and I walked the east boundary of your farm together in May of 1971. We marked 27 stones that afternoon." He kept his promise about those stones for 52 years. I am sorry he is not here to keep it with you. He sat us down at his kitchen table. He poured coffee from a blue enamel pot. He set a small cedar box on the table between us. He opened it. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, yellowed at the corners. It showed 2 men standing on a low rise of pasture with a line of cedars behind them, both of them holding shovels, both of them looking at the camera with the squint of men who do not love being photographed. The taller man was my grandfather Silas, 31 years old in 1971. The shorter man was Nathaniel's father, Joseph Whitehorse, who had been 63 that year. Joseph Whitehorse had died in 1979. His name was carved on a small stone in a graveyard on the edge of his own farm. Nathaniel said, "There are 26 other stones besides this one. They are on the east boundary of your property, on the slope that drops down toward Mill Creek. They are the burial markers of my people who lived on that land before any deed was ever issued by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. My people lived there from at least 1690 to about 1740. We were pushed off slowly by treaty and by trade, but the bones stayed. The bones always stay." He looked at me. He said, "Your grandfather found the first stone in the spring of 1971 while he was clearing brush along the east fence. He did not know what he had. He came to my father and he asked. My father told him, and your grandfather stood on that slope on land that his family had held the deed to for 122 years. And he said to my father, 'This is your ground. Whatever the paper says, I will hold it. I will not break it. And when the day comes that the paper can be made right, we will make it right together.'" He paused. He said, "He kept that promise, Adeline, every day for the rest of his life." I could not speak. He said, "But there is something else. Something he asked me not to tell you until you came home." He looked at Earl. Earl nodded. Nathaniel reached into the cedar box and lifted out a folded piece of paper. It was older than the photograph. It had been folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft. He opened it on the table. It was a deed. The grantor was a man named Harlan Boyd. The grantee was Elias Marcus Caldwell. The parcel was 60 acres situated on the east side of Maple Hollow Farm, bounded on the south by Mill Creek and on the east by the Township Road. The date was November 4th, 1937. The price was $420. The deed had been signed. It had been notarized. It had a clear chain of title. But it had never been recorded in the Lancaster County Recorder of Deeds office. Nathaniel said, "Your great-grandfather Elias bought 60 acres from Harlan Boyd in November of 1937. He paid for it in cash, most of which came from the furniture shop. The deed was real. The sale was real. But Elias never recorded it. He kept paying the property taxes on it under Harlan Boyd's name. He paid Harlan's widow $8 a year every year from 1942 until 1962 to keep her signature on the tax filings." He paused. He said, "Because if he had recorded that deed in 1937, the bank in Reading would have seen it, and they would have come after it for collateral on a loan he had co-signed for his brother-in-law. So he kept it off the books. He meant to record it in 1942 after the loan was paid off." He looked at me. He said, "He never got to." I waited. I knew what was coming.
I did not want to know it. I waited.
Nathaniel said, on the 14th of October, 1942, Elias Caldwell was found dead in the back pasture of his own farm. The county coroner, a man named Hiram Linwood, wrote the cause of death as accidental, struck by his own draft horse. He was 38 years old. He left a widow, Frances, who was 33, and a son, your grandfather Silas, who was 2. He paused.
He said, Frances Caldwell never accepted that finding. She told my father, and she told the Lutheran pastor in Mannheim, and she told the milkman who delivered to her back porch every Tuesday morning that her husband had been killed. She believed that until the day she died in 1968. She believed Wilhelm Kruger killed him.
He looked at Earl. Earl looked at me.
Nathaniel said, Wilhelm Kruger was Reuben Kruger's grandfather. He bought the land east of yours from a man named Geiger in the summer of 1940. He was 31 years old. He had come up from a coal town in West Virginia. Nobody in Lancaster County had heard of him before 1940. Nobody in Lancaster County could find a single relative of his after he died in 1981. He came in alone. He left no roots behind him. That kind of man, Adeline, that kind of man is rare in farm country, and it is worth paying attention to.
He pulled a second piece of paper out of the cedar box. It was a letter, typed on thin onion skin paper, dated the 3rd of November, 1942, 3 weeks after Elias Caldwell died. The letter was from a man named Cyrus Stigler, an attorney in Ephrata, Pennsylvania, addressed to Wilhelm Kruger. It confirmed that Mr. Kruger had retained Mr. Stigler's services to pursue, quote, the matter of the disputed eastern parcel adjacent to the Kruger farm, end quote, and that Mr. Stigler had begun the process of, quote, establishing color of title by adverse possession, end quote. 3 weeks. 3 weeks after Elias Caldwell's body had been put in a pine box and buried in Hopewell Cemetery, Wilhelm Kruger had hired a lawyer to start the process of claiming the 60 acres Elias had bought in 1937. 60 acres that on the public record were still in Harlan Boyd's name. 60 acres that no living person except Elias's widow Frances even knew existed in the Caldwell holdings. Nathaniel said Wilhelm Kruger filed adverse possession in 1942. He paid the back taxes on the parcel under Boyd's name. By 1962, after 20 years of paying taxes and farming the surface of it, the land was legally his. He paused. He said, but the deed your great-grandfather signed in 1937, the real deed, the one with Harlan Boyd's signature and the notary's stamp from November 4th, 1937, that deed never died. It just was never recorded. Your great-grandmother Frances had it. She gave it to your grandfather Silas on his 18th birthday in 1958. He hid it. He kept it for 65 years. He never recorded it. Because Wilhelm Kruger told him in 1962 in a feed store in Mannheim that if he ever tried to challenge the title, there would be more accidents in the Caldwell family. Your grandfather was 22 years old. He had just married your grandmother.
He let it go. He looked at me very steadily. He said, he did not let it go because he was afraid for himself. He let it go because he was afraid for her. And he carried that for 61 years.
I sat there at Nathaniel's kitchen table with the typewritten letter from 1942 in my hand, and I thought about my grandfather, and I thought about a feed store conversation in 1962 that nobody had ever spoken about. And I thought about a man named Wilhelm Kruger, who had come up from West Virginia in 1940 with no relatives and no past. And I thought about Wilhelm Kruger's grandson, Reuben, who had stood on my porch the day before in a clean flannel shirt and offered me $85,000 for everything, and who had laughed when I said I would think on it. The kind of laugh men use when they are already certain how a story ends. The kind of laugh that I now understood had been laughed in this valley before. In 1942, in a feed store, to a young man holding a deed he could not record, I said to Nathaniel, why did my grandfather decide to break that silence now? Why did he write the letter in April? Why did he record his promise on the cassette tape Earl says is somewhere in this house? Why now? Nathaniel looked at Earl. Earl looked at me.
Earl said, because in April of this year, Reuben Kruger came to your grandfather's back porch with a man in a blue suit from a company called Inner Core Energy Solutions. They offered your grandfather $600,000 for the mineral rights to the East 60 acres. They told him there was anthracite under that ground, high grade, worth $8 million on the open market. They told him that if he did not sign, they would find a way to make him sign.
Your grandfather walked them off the porch with a shotgun. He called me that night. He told me what he had decided to do. And then, 6 weeks later, he was dead in his own milking parlor at 5:30 in the morning.
I felt the kitchen go very quiet. I said, 6 weeks. Earl said, 6 weeks. I said, Earl, did my grandfather die of a heart attack? He did not answer right away. He looked at his coffee cup. He said, Adeline, I have been asking myself that question for 97 days, and I do not have an answer yet, but I have a suspicion, and I think we are going to find that suspicion confirmed before the snow falls.
I drove back to the farmhouse with Earl. The sun was low. The shadows of the cedars along the east fence stretched halfway across the back pasture. I sat at the kitchen table and I drank a glass of water. Earl made me eat a piece of toast. He left at 6 in the evening. He told me to call him the moment anything moved on the property. He told me he had spoken that morning before he came over to a state trooper named David Kohler, who he had known since 1991, and that David Kohler had agreed to meet us privately off the record the following Monday morning to look at the soil sample hole and the boot prints. He told me to lock the doors. I locked the doors. I sat in the kitchen with the shotgun across my knees, and I watched the light go down over the south pasture. And I thought about the false bottom in the cedar chest, and the burned thumbprint on the third board from the east wall of the smokehouse, and the typewritten letter
from 1942 and a feed store conversation in 1962 and a man in a blue suit on a back porch in April of 2023. I went upstairs at 9. I did not sleep. At 11 o'clock, I came back downstairs and I went into my grandmother's sewing room and I sat in front of the cedar chest and I lifted out the green ledgers and I lifted out the false bottom. And underneath the false bottom, in the corner of the chest, under a folded square of muslin, I found something I had not seen on my first pass. A small box, cardboard, about the size of a paperback book, faded blue. The kind of box that used to hold sewing notions. I opened it. Inside was a cassette tape. The label on the cassette had been written in my grandmother's hand. It said, "Only for Addie when she is older." There was no date. I sat on the floor of the sewing room and I held that cassette in both hands. And I understood in the way you sometimes understand things at 11 o'clock at night, with no warning that my grandmother had known too. That whatever my grandfather had been carrying since 1962, she had known about it for 52 years. That she had not just sewed quilts and run a cooperative. She had been keeping her own record, and that somewhere in this house there was a tape recorder of the kind they sold at Radio Shack in the 1980s, and on Monday morning when Earl came back, we were going to find it and we were going to listen. But that was Monday. This was Saturday night. I put the cassette back in the cardboard box. I put the cardboard box back in the corner of the cedar chest. I put the false bottom back. I put the green ledgers back. I put the Christmas linens on top of them. I closed the chest. I went downstairs. I sat at the kitchen table. The phone rang. It was almost midnight. I picked it up. Marlene Hadley's voice came on the line. She said, "Adeline, honey, I just heard the strangest thing down at the Plow and Stars. I think you should come over to my place tomorrow morning for coffee. I have something I need to tell you about your grandfather. Something I should have said a long time ago." I did not say anything for a moment. I looked at the locked front door. I looked at the shotgun on the table. I thought about a casserole dish on a front step, and a hand patting a wooden board beside her, and a piece of information delivered the way women in Lancaster County deliver information when they want you to think they are doing you a favor. I said, "Marlene, what was your maiden name?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. A long pause. Long enough that I had my answer before she gave it to me. She said, "Kruger, why?" I hung up the phone. I sat there in the dark kitchen with my hand still on the receiver, and I thought about a hot dish on a front step in September, and a woman who had let herself through the gate, and a man named Reuben Kruger who had driven up the lane the very next morning in a clean flannel shirt and had looked past me into the kitchen. He had not been looking at me. He had been listening. For 2 months,
Marlene Hadley had been carrying every word I said back across the section line. I stood up.
I walked to the kitchen window. I looked out across the dark yard at the milk house. The sign on the south door was barely visible in the starlight. Not selling. The wind was out of the north. The first frost was coming. The almanac on the wall said October 15th. The bank letter on the table said November 14th. The cassette tape from my grandmother said for Addie, when she is older. I was older now. I was older than I had been 6 days ago when I got off the bus at the corner of Route 23 and Mill Creek Road. I went to the kitchen drawer next to the stove. I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper from the pad my grandfather had used for writing down feed prices. I sat down at the table. I picked up the pencil. I wrote a list. At the top of the list, I wrote the words, "What I know." Underneath, I wrote, 1. The deed to 60 acres of East Pasture is real. It was signed in 1937. It was never recorded. Wilhelm Kruger took the surface of it by adverse possession in 1962. The deed still exists. 2. There are 27 Lenape burial stones on that 60 acres. Federal law protects them if they are documented. 3. There is high-grade anthracite under that ground. Enercor Energy Solutions wants the mineral rights. They offered $600,000 in April. My grandfather refused. 4. 6 weeks later, my grandfather was dead. 5. Marlene Hadley is Reuben Kruger's cousin. She has been reporting on me since September 14th. 6. Sheriff Holloway drinks with Reuben Kruger every Friday night at the Plow and Stars. We cannot use him. 7. There is a cassette tape from my grandmother in the cedar chest. There may be another from my grandfather somewhere in this house. We will find them both. I underlined the last line. I put the pencil down. I looked at the list for a long time. Then I picked the pencil back up, and at the bottom of the page, I wrote one more sentence. My grandfather kept a promise for 52 years. I am going to keep his. I folded the paper. I put it in the inside pocket of my coat next to the brass horseshoe key and the envelope marked Hayes. I picked up the shotgun. I walked through the dark house one more time, checking every door, every window, every latch. I went up to bed. I lay there listening to the wind moving over the tin roof and the slow ticking of the kitchen clock down the hall, and I thought about Sunday, which would be tomorrow, and Monday, which would bring Earl back with the state trooper, and I thought about the cassette tape in the cedar chest that my grandmother had labeled in her own hand more than 2 years before she died. I did not know yet that there was another cassette. I did not know yet that my grandfather had recorded his own voice in May of 2023, 9 days before he died, and that he had hidden that tape in a place even Earl Pemberton did not know about. I did not know yet that the answer to Earl's 97-day question, the question of whether my grandfather had really died of a heart attack alone in the milking parlor on the 11th of June,
was already on a 60-minute Maxell cassette, waiting for me to find it in a place I had walked past every day of my childhood without ever once stopping to look. I closed my eyes. I slept 4 hours. The wind shifted.
Outside in the back pasture near the line of cedars where the burial stones had stood for 300 years. The first frost of the autumn came down quiet over the grass, and the dark turned silver. And somewhere up the lane, a vehicle without headlights moved slow along the county road and stopped and waited, and the dust did not even rise behind it.
I woke before 5 on Sunday morning. The frost on the kitchen window was thick enough to scrape with a fingernail. The wind had stopped sometime in the night, and the silence in the house was the kind of silence that has weight to it. The silence of a house that is waiting for something.
I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with the shotgun across my knees and the cassette tape from the cedar chest on the wood in front of me. I had brought it down from the sewing room at 4 in the morning when I gave up on sleep. The label in my grandmother's hand looked up at me. For Addie, when she is older.
I did not have a tape player in the house. The old console stereo in the front parlor had a cassette deck, but I had not turned that machine on in 9 years, and I was not sure the belts were still good. I would need to wait for Earl. He had a player. He had told me so on Saturday afternoon in passing, when he had mentioned that he still kept his own service records on cassettes he had recorded in 1992, when he was thinking of writing a book and had decided he was not a writer. I waited.
I drank the coffee. I watched the eastern sky go from black to slate to the color of wet paper, and I thought about the vehicle I had heard on the county road at 3 in the morning. I had heard it through the bedroom window upstairs. A diesel engine, low and slow. It had stopped somewhere out past the gate. It had idled for almost 4 minutes. Then it had moved on without ever turning on its headlights. I had not slept after that. At 6:15, the phone rang. I picked it up on the second ring. Earl's voice said, "Stay inside. Do not go to the milk house. Do not go to the smokehouse. David Kohler is on his way. He will be there in 20 minutes. I am coming behind him." I said, "Earl, what happened?" He said, "Pete is on my porch. He came up the road in the dark. He is bleeding from a cut on his left flank. It is shallow. He will live. But somebody put a boot to him, Addie. Somebody on your property last night put a boot to your grandfather's dog, and that dog walked 3 miles in the cold to find me. Do not open the door for anyone but David or me. Do you understand?" I understood. I sat at the kitchen table with the shotgun across my knees, and I waited. The state trooper's car came up the lane at 6:37, unmarked. A dark gray Ford Interceptor with state plates. David Kohler got out. He was about 55. He was tall and lean, and his hair had gone gray at the temples in the way of men who have spent a long time looking at things they cannot fix. He wore a brown jacket over a plain blue shirt, no uniform, no badge visible, because Earl had told him not to advertise. He knocked.
I asked who it was. He gave me a code phrase Earl and I had agreed on the night before. I opened the door. He came in. He took off his hat. He set a small leather case on the kitchen table, and he sat down across from me, and he said one thing before he asked anything else. He said, "Adeline, I served 8 years with the Pennsylvania State Police before I went undercover. I am telling you that because what we are about to talk about cannot leave this room until I say it can, not even to Earl. Are we clear?" I said yes. He said, "Good."
Earl arrived 10 minutes later. He came in through the back porch. Pete was with him. The dog walked stiff on the left side, and there was a clean white bandage taped to his flank where Earl had cleaned and dressed the cut. And when Pete saw me, he came across the kitchen floor and laid his head on my knee, and he kept it there. I put my hand on the back of his neck. David Kohler looked at the dog. He looked at me. He said, "Tell me everything. From the beginning. Leave nothing out."
I told him.
I started with the bus stop at Route 23 and Mill Creek Road. I told him about Reuben Kruger's offer of $85,000. I told him about the brass key in the milk house and the mason jar on the third shelf, and the letter from my grandfather dated April 25th, 2023. I told him about the business card from Intercore Energy Solutions. I told him about the boot prints by the old well and the soil sample hole and the 2 sets of knee impressions in the dirt.
I told him about Nathaniel Whitehorse and the 27 burial stones on the east boundary. I told him about the typewritten letter from Cyrus Stigler in November of 1942. I told him about Wilhelm Kruger and a feed store in 1962. I told him about the cedar chest and the false bottom and the 14 green ledgers of my grandmother's cooperative. I told him about Marlene Hadley and her maiden name. I told him about the diesel engine on the county road at 3 in the morning, and about Pete, and about the boot.
He took notes the whole time. He did not interrupt once. When I was done, he closed his notebook. He looked at Earl. He said,
"Earl, I am going to need to use your back room for about an hour. I am going to need to make some phone calls that I cannot make from this house because I do not trust the line."
Earl nodded. David Kohler turned to me. He said, "Adeline, your grandfather did not die of a heart attack." The kitchen went very still.
He said,
"I cannot prove it yet, but I can tell you what I already know and what we are going to confirm before Friday."
He opened his notebook again. He said, "In April of this year, your grandfather called the Lancaster County District Attorney's office. He spoke to a young assistant DA named Caroline Vetter. He told her he had information about a 1942 homicide and an ongoing fraud scheme connected to mineral rights. He asked her to come out to the farm to take a recorded statement. She told him she would. She put it on her calendar for the 3rd week of June." He paused. He said, "Your grandfather died on June 11th. He paused again. He said, "Caroline Vetter went to her supervisor the next week and asked to be assigned the case anyway. She wanted to come out to the property and interview the family. Her supervisor, a man named Phil Ostermeyer, told her there was no case. He told her an 83-year-old man with a heart condition does not constitute a homicide investigation." He told her to drop it. He looked at me. He said, "Caroline Vetter did not drop it. She went home. She made notes. She kept them in a drawer at home. 2 weeks ago, she called me. She told me what she had. She told me she thought somebody in the DA's office was sitting on it because somebody in the DA's office was being paid. She gave me a name. The name was Phil Ostermeyer. The name on the other end of the wire transfer she had traced was Vincent Marsh, Enercor Energy Solutions Acquisitions Manager." The name on the business card from my kitchen floor. I put my hand on the cassette tape on the table. I said, "Mr. Kohler, I think you should hear this before you make your calls." I told him about the cedar chest. I told him about the cassette my grandmother had labeled for Addie when she is older. Earl went out to his truck. He came back with a portable cassette player from 1988 with a leather strap and 2D batteries already in it. He set it on the kitchen table. I put the cassette in. I pressed play. My grandmother's voice came out of that small plastic speaker as if she had walked back into the kitchen and pulled out her chair and sat down across from me. She had recorded it in March of 2019, before the stroke that had taken her ability to speak in the last year of her life. The tape ran 43 minutes. She told me about Wilhelm Kruger and what her mother-in-law Frances had known and what Frances had told her on a Tuesday afternoon in 1971, sitting at the same kitchen table. She told me about the night in 1962 when Wilhelm Kruger had stopped my grandfather Silas in the parking lot of Faulkner's feed store in Mannheim, and what he had said and what my grandfather had not said back. She told me where Francis Caldwell had buried the original 1937 deed. Not in the smokehouse, not in the milk house, but under the floor of the old root cellar, behind the spring house, in a sealed canning jar 12 inches down, marked by a flat stone with a small horseshoe scratched into it. She told me one more thing. She said, "Addie, if your grandfather is gone before you hear this, and you find yourself wondering whether he went the way the doctors said he went, you find Earl Pemberton. You find Nathaniel Whitehorse. You ask them what your grandfather was working on in his last spring. You make them tell you. Your grandfather was the most stubborn man I ever loved. He carried his father's silence for 61 years. He was not going to carry it into a 60-second. They knew that, and they were going to stop him." The tape ran out. The little plastic player clicked. The kitchen was quiet for a long time. David Kohler closed his notebook. He stood up. He picked up the cassette. He put it inside a small evidence envelope from his leather case. He sealed the envelope. He said, "I need to make those calls." He left. Earl and I sat at the kitchen table. Pete was asleep at my feet with his head on my boot. The light through the kitchen window had gone full gold. The kind of light you get in Lancaster County on a clear Sunday morning in late September. The kind that falls on the floorboards in long, warm stripes and makes you remember every other morning you have ever sat in this same kitchen. I said, "Earl, we have to find the second tape." He said, "I know." We started in the spring house.
The spring house was an old stone building, the oldest building on the property, built directly over the cold spring that ran out of the south slope of the hill. The Hayes family had built it in 1851. It had not been used for keeping milk cold since the 1950s, but the water still ran clear and the stone walls still stood true. Behind the spring house against the slope was the root cellar. A low door, a short flight of stone steps down into the ground. The cellar had not been opened in years. We went down with 2 lanterns. The floor was packed earth. The walls were stone. The air smelled like cold stone and old potatoes. I found the flat stone with the small scratched horseshoe in the southeast corner. It took me 20 minutes of crawling on my hands and knees with the lantern at a low angle to see it. The mark was no bigger than my thumbnail. We pried up the stone. We dug down with a hand trowel, 12 inches. The trowel struck glass. I brushed away the dirt. It was a canning jar, wax sealed. The wax was yellowed with age. Inside the jar, I could see a folded sheet of heavy paper. It was the 1937 deed, the original, signed by Harlan Boyd, notarized by a man named Theodore Reisinger. The grantee line read, Elias Marcus Caldwell. The price was $420. 86 years that paper had been in the ground. 86 years. We took it back to the house. David Kohler came back from Earl's place at 11:30. He looked at the deed. He photographed it. He had us put it in a fresh jar and seal it again and put it back in the cabinet in the smokehouse for safekeeping, because he said he did not want to move the original off the property until he had federal warrants in place. Then he said, Adeline, I have spoken to my superiors. I have spoken to the FBI field office in Philadelphia. I have spoken to a federal magistrate. We have an investigation, officially, as of 9:47 this morning. But I need one more thing from you. I waited. He said, Your grandmother told you on that tape that there might be a recording your grandfather made before he died. Earl tells me your grandfather was a careful man. A man like that, if he knew he was being watched, would not put a tape in the same building where he kept the letter. He paused. He said, Where would he put it? I sat there in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window, and I thought about my grandfather, Silas Caldwell. I thought about a man who had pulled a stranger through a chain-link fence at Checkpoint Charlie in 1963. A man who had carried that secret for 60 years and never told a soul, not even his wife. I thought about my grandmother Cordelia, who had run a cooperative for 27 years and never told a single one of the families they had helped. I thought about my great-grandmother Frances, who had buried a deed in a root cellar in 1942, with her 2-year-old son sleeping in the house behind her, knowing that if anybody found her, she would die the same way her husband had. I thought about a family that hid things in the ground, in the walls, under the floor, in the false bottom of cedar chests. And I thought about the one place on this farm that nobody, not even Reuben Kruger, would ever think to dig. I stood up. I said, He put it under Cordelia. Earl looked at me.
David Kohler looked at me. I said he put it under my grandmother's grave. Hopewell Cemetery sat on a small rise of ground, a half-mile north of the farmhouse on a parcel that the Lutheran Church had owned since 1853. There were maybe 200 stones in it. Caldwell's, Hayes's. Pemberton's wife was buried there. Most of the surrounding section was. My grandmother's stone was a simple gray granite slab 2 feet wide, set flat in the ground the way she had wanted it. Cordelia Hayes Caldwell, 1946 to 2021. Her stone had been placed beside the empty plot that my grandfather would have filled. Now did fill. His stone had been set only 6 weeks earlier. The grass over his grave had not yet fully knitted in. We went up to the cemetery on Sunday afternoon. The 3 of us. David Kohler stayed in the truck on the access road because he said his presence as a state employee in uniform on private cemetery property without a warrant for that specific location would be a problem if it came up in court later. He said this with a kind of dry patience that told me he had thought about every angle for hours already. Earl and I walked up alone. The flat stones at Cordelia's plot had been set on a poured concrete base. There were 3 large stones around the head of the grave set into the concrete in a small border. The 3rd stone, the one furthest east, had a hairline crack along its bottom edge that did not match the others. I knelt down. I worked my fingers into the crack. The stone lifted. It was not set in concrete. It was set in fresh masonry sand, packed firm, made to look like concrete. Underneath was a small steel box, about the size of a man's hand, painted dark green. Military surplus, a box my grandfather had probably brought back from Berlin in 1965. I lifted it out. I took it back to the truck. We drove back to the farmhouse with the box in my lap, and I held it the whole way, and I did not speak. In the kitchen, I set the box on the table. David Kohler put on a pair of nitrile gloves. He opened the box. Inside were 3 things. A small bottle of prescription medication with a Reedsville pharmacy label dated March 2023. The patient name was Silas Caldwell. The medication was digoxin 0.25 milligrams. There was 1 half-dissolved capsule still inside. The label had a clear thumbprint on it, smeared in old grease, the kind of grease a man gets on his hand from working at a pharmacy compounding station. A 60-minute Maxell cassette tape with no label. And a brown spiral notebook, the kind a schoolchild uses with the words, "My own observations," written across the front cover in my grandfather's hand. David Kohler put the bottle into another evidence envelope. He set the cassette beside the player on the table. He looked at me. He said, "Adeline, before we listen, I need you to be ready. I have heard 100 recordings in my career. Some of them I still cannot forget. If you need to step out, you step out. If you need to stop the tape, you stop the tape. There is no right way to hear this." I nodded. I sat down. Earl sat beside me. He did not touch me. He sat close enough that I could feel his arm against mine. The way men of his generation sat beside women who were about to have to be brave. David Kohler put the cassette in.
He pressed play. My grandfather's voice came out of that small plastic speaker on a Sunday afternoon in September of 2023. 9 days before he died, and he spoke to me directly by name, as if he had known the morning would come when I would sit at this kitchen table and put this tape in this player and listen. He said, "Addie, it is May 16th, 2023. I am alone in the milk house. The radio is off. I have about 30 minutes before Cordelia would have wanted me to come in for lunch if she were still alive. I would not be making this tape if she were still alive, because she would have made me go to the police 2 weeks ago, and I am not going to the police because the police in this county cannot be trusted in this particular matter." He paused. I could hear him breathe. "I am being poisoned. I have been being poisoned since the second week of March. I noticed the first symptoms on March 14th, a Tuesday. Dizziness on standing, slight nausea after my morning medication. By the end of March, it was worse. Heart palpitations, a peculiar metallic taste behind my teeth. I am 83 years old, Addie. I have had a heart condition since 1997. The first thing I thought was that the heart was just finally giving out. I went to Dr. Heffelfinger in Lidditz the second week of April. He ran the panels. He told me my potassium was low, my magnesium was low, my white count was elevated. He told me he could not explain it. He said he wanted to put me on a different statin and see if I improved. Another pause. I did not improve. I got worse. By the end of April, I could barely walk to the milk house without stopping to rest. And that was when I started to think it through. A heart patient on 12 different daily medications in a county where his nearest neighbor wants his land more than that neighbor wants his own grandchildren to thrive, and a pharmacist 5 miles up the road who is that neighbor's grandson. The kitchen was so quiet, I could hear the kitchen clock ticking down the hall. His name is Garrett Kruger. He took over the Reedsville Pharmacy in 2019. He is Reuben Kruger's grandson. He fills my prescriptions. He has been filling them for 4 years. He has my full chart. He knows exactly which combination of substances would mimic a cardiac event in a man with my history. A breath. On the 8th of May, I did something I am not proud of. I had Earl drive me up to a different pharmacy, the CVS in Lebanon. I told them I had lost a bottle and needed a replacement supply of my digoxin. I paid cash. I did not run it through insurance. I came home with 2 bottles of the same medication, one from Reedsville, filled by Garrett on April 21st, one from CVS, filled by a stranger on May 8th. The pills looked identical to the naked eye. They were not identical. I took the Reedsville bottle to a friend in Harrisburg who used to work for the state crime lab. He tested 2 of the capsules for me as a favor. He did not ask why. The Reedsville capsules contained the digoxin they were supposed to. They also contained between 4 and 6 milligrams of arsenic trioxide per capsule. Slow, cumulative, designed to look like a natural decline in a heart patient. designed to take 6 months.
He paused for a long moment.
I am not going to take 6 months, Addie, because on the morning of May 14th, I made a mistake. I drove past the back of Reuben Kruger's property line. I saw 2 pickup trucks I did not recognize at the rise above my east pasture. I pulled off the county road and I watched them through binoculars for 40 minutes. They were taking soil samples. 3 men. One of them was Vincent Marsh from Intercore Energy Solutions. The other 2 were geologists. Reuben Kruger came out to meet them.
He gave them a check. They left.
A breath.
That night, after Cordelia would have wanted me to be in bed, I drove up to the rise above their property line, and I parked behind their barn, and I sat there in the dark for 2 hours with a small recorder Earl had given me in 1991. And at 11:46 p.m. on May 14th, 2023, I recorded Reuben Kruger and Garrett Kruger having a conversation on the back porch of Reuben's house less than 30 feet from where I was sitting. The recording is on the other side of this cassette.
I am about to flip it over.
A click. A silence of maybe 4 seconds. Then a different recording. Tinnier. More distant. Outdoor sound. 2 men's voices. The first voice, deeper and older, was Reuben Kruger. He said, "How much longer?" The second voice, younger, was Garrett. He said, 3 weeks, maybe 4. The dosage is at 5 milligrams now. His liver enzymes will be all over the map. When he goes, it will look like a heart event, just like Wilhelm always said. A pause.
Reuben said, "Speed the old man along, Garrett. The granddaughter is 19 years old. She has no money. She will sell for nothing. She will not even know what she is signing." Garrett said, "I will bump him to 6 on the next refill." Reuben said, "Good. Enercore wants to be in the ground by August." A door opened, a door closed. The recording ended. The cassette played silence for a few seconds. Then my grandfather's voice came back. He said, "Addie, that is the recording. If you are listening to this, I am gone. I want you to understand that I knew. I made a decision. I could have run. I could have driven to Harrisburg the next morning and walked into the state police barracks and put this tape on a desk and let them protect me. I chose not to. I chose to stay on this farm and keep doing the morning milking and the evening feeding and the things a man does on a farm he has worked for 60 years. Because if I had run, Reuben would have known, and Reuben would have moved on you the moment I was off the property. I needed time to put the pieces in place. I needed time to find your great-grandfather's deed and confirm it. I needed time to record this tape. I needed time to write the letter that is in the milk house jar.
I needed time to set the brass horseshoe key with Earl and the cedar chest tape with your grandmother's instructions and the smokehouse cabinet with the family ledgers. I needed about 6 weeks.
I think they are going to give me about 3.
A pause. I am sorry, Addie. I am sorry you are hearing this. I am sorry your 19th year on this earth has to be the year you carry this. But you are a Hayes on your grandmother's side and a Caldwell on mine, and we do not run, sweetheart. We do not run. We make the case. We document it. We trust the right people. We bring it into the light. His voice broke a little there, just for one word. He came back steady.
Earl is the right person. Nathaniel is the right person. There will be a state trooper. He may already be at this table with you. Trust him too. Do not trust the sheriff. Do not trust the DA's office until Earl tells you who to talk to. Do not sign anything. Do not let Reuben in the house. Do not eat anything that comes onto this property from a Kruger kitchen.
A pause. I love you, Addie. I have loved you since the night your mother brought you home from the hospital in 2004, and I held you on the porch of this farmhouse, and I told you the names of every fence post on the south boundary, because I wanted them in your ears before any other words. You did not understand them then. You will understand them now. A breath.
Open the doors, read the notebooks, stand on the porch. The farm is yours. The deed is yours. The promise to Joseph Whitehorse is yours. The cooperative is yours if you decide you want to take it up again. Cordelia would be glad. A long breath. I am going to make myself a sandwich now. I am going to put this tape in the green box, and I am going to put the green box where I have decided to put it. And tomorrow morning, I am going to go back to milking the cows like an old man with a tired heart. Goodbye, Addie. Be brave, but more important than brave, be patient. Patient gets the door open. Brave only kicks it. The tape clicked off. The kitchen sat in silence.
I do not remember what I did for the next 10 minutes. Earl told me later I did not cry. I just sat. He said I held the edge of the table with both hands, and I sat. Pete put his head on my knee. David Kohler quietly stood up and walked to the window, and he stood there with his back to us for a long time. When I came back to myself, the light had shifted across the kitchen floor. David Kohler turned around. He said, "Adeline, with your permission, I am going to make the arrests on Friday morning. There is a town hall meeting in Mannheim on Thursday night. Reuben Kruger is the keynote speaker. He is presenting a proposal from Enercore Energy Solutions to the township supervisors. He has lined up community support for what he is calling, quote, a regional economic development partnership, end quote. He believes he has the votes." He paused. He said, "I would like you to be there." He said, "I would like you to bring the tapes." The town hall meeting was held at the Mannheim Township Community Center in the gymnasium of what used to be the old elementary school before the new one was built in 1998. The folding chairs were set up in 28 rows, 8 chairs across, and by 7 o'clock on Thursday evening, the 20th of October 2023, every one of those 224 chairs was full, and there were people standing along the back wall and along both side walls. It was the biggest turnout for a township meeting in 14 years. Reuben Kruger was at the front of the room. He was wearing a navy blue suit. I had never seen him in a suit. He looked smaller in it. His face was flushed pink, and his thinning hair had been combed back wet, and he was shaking hands with the township supervisors at the long table and laughing at something one of them had said. And Vincent Marsh from Intercore was standing beside him in a charcoal suit with a paper folder under his arm. Behind them, on an easel, was a large color rendering of what they were proposing to do to the east section of Lancaster County. Wells, pipelines, a processing facility. The map showed 60 acres in red. 60 acres. They did not own 60 acres. That on the public record still showed as belonging to Reuben Kruger through his grandfather, Wilhelm. I sat in the front row. Earl sat to my right. Nathaniel Whitehorse sat to my left. Pete sat under my chair, leaning against my left calf, the way he had been leaning against my left calf for 6 days straight. The chairman of the township supervisors, a man named Henry Lapp, who had known my grandfather for 40 years, and who I would learn later had refused 2 separate offers from Intercore to lease his own back 50 acres, opened the meeting at 7:05. He read the agenda. He said, "Public comment will be the last item before the vote. Anybody wishing to speak should sign the clipboard at the back of the room." I had already signed it. I had signed it as Adeline Marie Caldwell. The presentation lasted 48 minutes. Vincent Marsh did most of the talking. He spoke about jobs. He spoke about tax revenue. He spoke about energy independence. He spoke about Lancaster County's chance to be at the forefront of, quote, a new chapter in Pennsylvania's industrial heritage, end quote. Reuben Kruger stood beside him with his hands clasped in front of him the whole time, nodding at the right moments, the way a man nods when he has practiced. Several local residents got up to speak. 2 were in favor. 3 were opposed. The room was tense. I could feel it. The room had not decided. At 8:03, Henry Lapp said, "Final speaker on the public comment clipboard, Miss Adeline Caldwell of Mill Creek Road." I stood up. I walked to the small wooden podium in the center of the floor. I set my notes on the podium. I did not look at them. I had brought them only because Earl had said it would steady me to have something to put my hands on. He had been right. I rested my fingers on the paper. I looked out at the gymnasium. 224 faces. I said, "My name is Adeline Caldwell. My grandfather was Silas Caldwell. He worked the farm at the end of Mill Creek Road for 52 years. He died on the 11th of June. The coroner ruled it a heart attack." I paused. I said, "It was not a heart attack." The room went very still. I said, "On the 16th of May, 2023, 9 days before he died, my grandfather recorded a cassette tape.
I am going to play part of that tape now. With the permission of the township supervisors and the Pennsylvania State Police, who have been investigating this matter for the past 6 weeks. Henry Lapp said, "You have permission, Miss Caldwell."
David Kohler was at the back of the room with 2 other troopers in plain clothes. I had not introduced him. He did not stand up. I lifted the small portable cassette player from the shelf inside the podium. I put the cassette in. I had cued it to the right place that afternoon. I pressed play. My grandfather's voice came through the gymnasium's PA system because Earl had patched the cassette player into the sound board. The technician at the school had let us use, and my grandfather, Silas Caldwell, dead. 131 days spoke to 224 of his neighbors from a Maxell cassette tape recorded in a milk house on a Tuesday afternoon in May. He said the part about the poisoning. He said the part about Garrett Kruger and the Reedsville pharmacy and the arsenic trioxide. Then I played the recording from the back porch. Reuben Kruger's voice. Garrett Kruger's voice. Speed the old man along. The granddaughter is 19. She will sell for nothing. The room did not move. I stopped the tape. I looked at Reuben Kruger. His face had gone the color of old paper. I said, "I am not selling. I am not signing." The 60 acres east of my main pasture were purchased by my great-grandfather, Elias Caldwell, in November of 1937 from Harlan Boyd. The original deed exists. It is in the custody of the Pennsylvania State Police. Beneath that ground are 27 Lenape burial markers documented by Nathaniel Whitehorse and Joseph Whitehorse in 1971, with my grandfather present. Under federal law, that land cannot be drilled. Under federal law, that land cannot be quarried. Under federal law, that land returns to protected status the moment a federal magistrate signs the order, which I am told will happen tomorrow morning. I paused. I looked at the supervisors. I said, "There will be no vote tonight." Reuben Kruger moved. He came across the floor of the gymnasium with his right hand up, and his face changed, and he was not a man in a suit anymore. He was the thing he had always been underneath the suit, and he came at me fast, and I did not move because Earl had told me on Wednesday evening that I would not need to move. Earl Pemberton stepped between us. He was 78 years old. He stood 5'9". He was not a big man. He stepped in front of me, and he put his left hand flat against Reuben Kruger's chest. And Reuben Kruger hit Earl Pemberton in the face once, and Earl Pemberton did not go down. And the 2 state troopers behind David Kohler were already moving, and the 3rd one came in from the side door, and they had Reuben Kruger on the gymnasium floor in cuffs in less than 9 seconds. Vincent Marsh tried to walk toward the exit. He did not make it. By 8:19, the gymnasium was emptying out. Reuben Kruger was in the back of a state police cruiser. Vincent Marsh was in the back of another one. Garrett Kruger was being arrested at his apartment in Reedsville at that same moment by 2 troopers and an FBI agent. Sheriff Holloway was being taken into custody at his home.
where the agents would later report he had been packing a duffel bag. Earl Pemberton sat in a folding chair at the front of the gymnasium with an ice pack against his left cheek. The cut over his eyebrow needed 3 stitches, which a paramedic put in on a folding table beside him. He did not flinch. He looked at me across the room, and he nodded once. The way he had nodded the morning I had painted the sign for the milk house door, and I felt something in my chest unbend that had been bent since the 14th of September. I walked over. I sat down in the chair beside him. I did not say anything for a long minute. Then I said, "Earl, thank you." He said, "Addie, I have been waiting 48 years to do that. He just happened to be the man I did it to." He turned his head a little, and he winced from the cut, and he looked at me from his good eye. He said, "Your grandfather pulled me through a fence in 1963. I have just pulled his granddaughter through a different one. We are square, sweetheart. We are square."
The case took 14 months. Reuben Kruger was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, mineral fraud, criminal solicitation, and bribery of a public official. He was sentenced to 35 years in state prison. Garrett Kruger was convicted of murder in the second-degree prescription tampering and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 22 years. Sheriff Holloway resigned and was indicted on 6 counts of public corruption. Phil Ostermeyer, the assistant DA, was indicted on 3 counts and disbarred. Vincent Marsh and Enercor Energy Solutions were fined $14 million in federal civil penalties for violations of the Clean Water Act, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Enercor withdrew from all Mid-Atlantic operations in 2024. The 1942 killing of Elias Caldwell was formally opened as a cold case by the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office in February of 2024. The case was closed in May of 2024, with a posthumous finding of homicide against Wilhelm Kruger. Elias Caldwell's name was added to the county memorial for unsolved farm deaths of the World War II era. The Kruger estate was ordered to pay restitution to the Caldwell estate in the amount of $1.2 million. I used the first $300,000 of it to pay off the bank in full and to start the operating account for the next farming year. Marlene Hadley came up the lane one Sunday morning in late January. She stood on the porch with no casserole and no excuses. She tried to apologize. I let her finish. Then I said, "Marlene, I am not going to call the sheriff on you. I am not going to take you to court. But you are going to leave this property right now, and you are not going to come back. And the next time we pass each other in town, you will not look at me, and I will not look at you. That is the deal. Do you understand?" She understood. She walked back down the lane. She has not been back. The 60 acres on the east side of my farm were placed under joint stewardship with the Delaware Tribe of Indians in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, in April of 2024.
The burial markers were surveyed and registered. The land cannot be developed, sold, or leased for extractive purposes. It is held in trust forever. Nathaniel Whitehorse comes by every other Saturday and walks the perimeter with me. We have planted 73 native hardwood saplings along the slope. They will be a forest by the time my own granddaughter is the age I am now, if I am lucky enough to have one. I opened my great-grandfather's furniture shop again in March of 2024. I had to learn everything from scratch. Earl taught me to read a hand-forged hinge. A retired cabinet maker from Strasbourg, a man named Walter Klinghoffer, who had known my great-grandfather as a boy, agreed to come up 2 days a week and show me how to dovetail a drawer and how to plane a joint flat. By August, I had 11 paying orders in the book. By November 26, the shop runs at a small profit now. The brass plate on this cabinet in the smokehouse still reads Caldwell & Sons, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, 1923. I have not changed it. I do not intend to. Walter Klinghoffer asked me once if I might want to. I told him no. I told him the brass plate was right the first time. He had not known what I meant. He nodded anyway. I opened my grandmother's cooperative again in May of 2024. 19 women came to the first meeting. By the end of the summer, we were back up to 23. We have helped 4 families this year. None of those 4 families know we have helped them. They will never know. That is how my grandmother wanted it. That is how she taught me to want it too. Memorial Day 2024 was a clear morning. The sky was the kind of blue you can almost taste. My grandfather had raised an American flag on a white pole at the edge of the side yard every Memorial Day since 1971. I raised it that morning before sunrise. Earl came up the lane at 7. Nathaniel came at 7:30. We stood together at the new memorial stone I had set into the ground beside my grandmother's grave at Hopewell Cemetery the week before. The stone was small. It was simple. It read, "In honor of Silas William Caldwell, U.S. Army Berlin Brigade, 1962 to 1965, and of his friend and brother Earl Pemberton, U.S. Army Berlin Brigade, 1962 to 1965, and of Joseph Whitehorse, who walked this ground before any of us, and of the men who did not come home from East Berlin, October 1963. Earl set his old Army Commendation Medal on top of the stone. He did not say anything. He stood at attention. He held a salute for 10 seconds. Then he stepped back, and Nathaniel stepped forward, and Nathaniel said a few words in Lenape that I did not understand and did not need to. I stood between the two of them. I looked out across the south pasture where the clover my grandfather had seeded in 1971 was just beginning to bloom for the 53rd spring in a row, and I thought about how he had told me before I was old enough to understand the words, the names of every fence post on the south boundary. I understood them now. There is one more thing. I am going to say this part directly because the man my grandfather wanted me to say it to is probably listening to this story right now in a kitchen somewhere in this country
with the radio on low and a cup of coffee gone cold beside him. If you have inherited a weight, if somebody is telling you that you are too young or too small or too tired or too alone to hold what your people have left in your hands,
if somebody is offering you a fair price that is not fair, if somebody has put a boot to your dog, open the doors they do not want you to open. Read the notebooks. Find the cassettes. Walk down to the root cellar and lift the flat stone. You are not as alone as you think. Somebody is already on their way. They have been waiting a long time to pay it back. My grandfather kept his promise for 52 years. I am keeping his. The flag is still up on the pole this morning. The smokehouse cabinet still smells like linseed oil and old paper. The brass horseshoe key is on a leather cord around my neck and has been every day since the 16th of September. The wind is out of the north. I can smell the river. My grandfather used to say that meant rain inside of 2 days. I trust it now.